Hello and welcome to the next in the JCI series, Conversations with Giants in Medicine. I'm Ushma Neal. Today I'm lucky to get to spend some time with Dr. Stanley Prusiner of the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Prusner's discovery that a protein alone could be infectious was considered heretical when he reported it in 1982. At the time, we thought that infections could only be transmitted by bacteria, fungi, viruses, and parasites. Now we know that these proteins, called prions that acquire an alternative shape and coax neighboring proteins to do the same, undergird a variety of neurodegenerative disorders. For his dogma-shattering work, Prusiner has received a number of different prizes, including the 1997 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Prusiner.
I'm delighted to be here.
Do you think you could start by telling me a little bit about your parents and where you grew up and what some of your early influences were?
Well, I don't remember growing up first in Des Moines, Iowa, but that was World War II, 1942, and then a little later in Cincinnati, Ohio. And eventually we moved back to Des Moines, and we stayed in Des Moines for a while, and then went back to Cincinnati. These two Midwestern cities, Cincinnati being the nicer of the two, but not so great after living in San Francisco for 30 plus years. Uh, and I really didn't get the bug and the excitement of science until I matriculated to the University of Pennsylvania as a freshman.
So,
Uh,
how did you choose chemistry as your major? What were your sort of early path that led you there?
uh, what happened was, when I was in high school, my homeroom teacher was a man named Jake Skilkin. And Jake Skilkin was a chemist, and he taught the advanced chemistry course. And I told him I would like to take the course, but a whole bunch of us had been told that we had correctly done a physics problem. We'd done it in, the answer was incorrect, but we all said the same thing. That's because the physics problem was not well described. So he wouldn't allow anybody who had gotten a D in physics to take his course the next year. So then I said to my parents, would you ask him if, because I'm getting nowhere with him? And he said, no, he'll never understand. There's no way he can understand this. So I didn't take the course. And then I tutored everybody in the regular chemistry course. This was a college preparatory high school, but a public high school in Cincinnati. Uh, so that's where this all begins.
So, you
Uh,
majored in chemistry out of spite.
I hope not. I hope not. Chemistry was always easy. So I knew that I wanted to go to medical school. I didn't want to become a chemist. Um,
So, the
and
roots of your interest in medicine were early.
yeah, well, my father was an architect, um, and he never made a very good living, and he was always upset that things weren't better. And as very frequently in the world of Jews, they became doctors. And so my household was no different, except my mother was pushing the medicine side of this. He was only pushing, you can do anything you want, but be an architect. So that's where it went. And my brother, who also became a doctor.
So, you are at Penn doing chemistry. How did you manage to get some of your first research experience, and what was that on?
It's now the third year of my college time. And I said to my aunt, who lived in Philadelphia and knew a lot of people, prominent family, I said, can you arrange for me to meet somebody so that I could do a little research because I might need that to get into medical school? Well, it turned out wasn't true, but um, anyway, it turned out that this was the turning point in my life because um, the head of medicine, of all medicine, was a man named I.S. Rabden, who became very famous because he operated on Eisenhower's bowel. Uh, and so he was the one who said he saw this guy walking down the hall who he knew was a surgical uh, assistant professor. And he said, named Sidney Wolfson. And he said, how about if I send you somebody to do some research? And he said, yeah, sure, it's okay. And that's how it all happened. So he sent me there. Uh, and Sidney Wolfson, who's now in his early 90s, still alive, um, as is his wife, Tucky. And he he showed me how to read a scientific paper, how to write a scientific paper, uh, how to think about science. And it was great. I mean, he was not a chemist. So later I exited from the more physiologic to the more chemical side, but he was really great. And I owe my career to him because he made science really attractive when I met him. And from then on, I just kept going.
Wonderful. So you ended up in the lab of the legendary Britton Chance doing stuff that was perhaps a little bit more related to brown adipose tissue and metabolism and energenetics, yes?
I went to Wolfson one day and I said, I think I got an idea about something I could do, but I need Britton Chance. And he said, well, go talk to him. So I went for one floor down and I sat down with him for a few minutes and I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, well, when do you want to start? And my idea was to use an instrument that he had designed that could measure fluorescence off the surface of an organ. And I wanted to look what happens during hibernation to hamsters, and when they arouse from hibernation, what happens to their brown adipose tissue? Because I assumed that oxidation rate went way up uh, to warm up the animals, and that's exactly what happened. But I was able to get a cold room. I was able to get the animals to hibernate, and then with Chance's help, I could use one of the instruments that he had made to measure the surface fluorescence, and I could see that it went way up. It was a nice set of experiments. It wasn't anything earth-shattering, but it was great for me because I learned a lot.
And so then this continued, this sort of pattern of being able to do some amount of research while in school while you remained at medical school at Penn, yes?
Yes, yes, yeah. I kept doing this, um, and my mother had a friend who was in charge of a large number of people who were employees at the NIH. And so this is the beginning of the Vietnam War. And her friend is telling her that I should apply to the NIH to uh, carry out my interest in research and ideally not go to Vietnam. Uh, so that's the next chapter.
Right. So during this time, you have this spot at the NIH, but you decided to do at least one intern year at UCSF. So walk
No,
us through why
no,
you chose
no,
that.
no. I
Oh,
didn't
please help
decide
me correct.
anything. The NIH decided it. You had to do the internship. I would have just punted and I would have gone off and I would have been science. I never would have been involved with clinical medicine, but this was mandatory. And so I had to go do an internship. And I chose to go to the University of California in San Francisco. Um, And in large part, that was because I spent much of the fourth year in Stockholm doing my research on brown adipose tissue. Um, and when I went for an interview, a preliminary interview uh, at Harvard, they were not interested in me if I wasn't going to show up at their main interview. And I said, I don't have any money. I can't fly from Stockholm to your interview. And that was the end of that. And that's how I ended up in San Francisco, which was really a incredible pot of luck for as far as I'm concerned. Um, and so I did the internship. It was not easy. It was every other night. It was a bear. When I was at the NIH, I worked with a man named Earl Statman, who was an extraordinary biochemist. And he charted my course because he discovered the modification of an enzyme called glutamine synthetase. And he showed that this was true and that it modulated the activity of the enzyme by 5 different approaches. And here I was reading his papers and doing my work on another enzyme called glutaminase. Um, and I'm saying to myself, why did he do this? What a waste of money. He knew one way would have been enough. He knew it all. And he that's not what he was doing. And I thought about it for a while, and I said, oh, he doesn't want to be wrong. He wants to get it right because he wants a solid foundation to the next step and the next step. And that's the whole Scrapie story is built on that. The whole discovery of prions emanates from that one paper, and sitting there and saying, why the hell is he doing this over and over again? And maybe it's because he doesn't have to write a grant at the NIH. So he just asks for things and they come, and therefore he can twiddle his thumbs and he can do the same experiment over and over and over again and get the same result. And then I said, no, that's not what he was doing.
So I'd love to then move along to then you return to UCSF for your neurology residency.
Right.
And within the first couple of months, you met a really pivotal patient
Yes.
that impacted the rest of your career,
Yeah.
a woman who would go on to develop CJD. But I'm just wondering why that particular patient was so impactful as opposed to any of the other patients that you might have seen with migraine or autism or, any other kind of neurologic deficits.
Oh, this is really easy. So here I am. I don't know what's going on, and neither does anybody else, I think. But the attending makes it very clear. A British trained neurologist. He said this woman probably has Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and then when I looked it up, yes, that's true. And then we had a few discussions about the patient who was getting progressively worse, but people could stay a long time in the hospital in those days. And so I watched this woman deteriorate day after day after day, which was extraordinary. But then the second month came a man named Dick Beringer, who was a herpes virologist, neurologist, but he knew a lot about Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease because it was transmissible. He knew the whole story with Kuru, and he could sit and talk about this indefinitely. And so he would be part of rounds, but this woman stayed for about 6 months. I shouldn't say that. The 2 months that I was on the service, she was there, and then she went off to a nursing home, and then she came back when I was on the service again a couple months later, and then I watched her die. And so I saw the whole natural history of this. I learned an enormous amount from Dick Beringer, and then that prompted me to start reading. And once I started to read about the field, there was a lot of literature, but it wasn't the kind of literature I wanted because it was not about the chemistry. It was about the science, the neurology and the transmissibility. And this was exceedingly interesting. So the whole year I just spent I read everything there was to read that was any way related. And I couldn't think of a better problem. And I tried several times to come up with a better problem because this problem was very difficult because the long time periods, the amount of money you needed, which was always difficult to raise, and people really didn't believe what I would tell them. There were a lot of hurdles, but the science was so fascinating. What was this thing? I mean, I remember saying one day to myself, "Oh my God, maybe I can come up with some better approach to something else. It'll be easier, and I won't have to think about it every minute." But I never found it.
You were able to establish your lab at the University of California, San Francisco, and had some early funding success, though I note that it was largely on like the choroid plexus. But Can you talk a little bit about what both the funding climate, the academic climate, the political climate were like? Because you weathered some ups and downs at that point in your career.
So the choroid plexus was because I needed a project that thought I could get funded, and I could also get a career development award off of it. And so there was an enzyme called gamma glutamyl transpeptidase, and it had a colorimetric assay. And I thought the choroid plexus might be an area where there was a lot of this protein because I think it's been seen in rats or mice, but I wanted something bigger to be able to work with so I could grind it up and study the protein. And so there was a slaughterhouse just across the bay. It doesn't exist anymore in, in San Francisco, as you can imagine. But I would go there and collect the choroid plexus from the brains of these slaughtered cows. I didn't even want the brain. I just wanted the choroid plexus, and they were happy to give it to me. And so that was the first grant I got, and I also got a career development award out of that. And then shortly after that, I got a Howard Hughes Award, and I gave back the career development award. But then after about 5 years, some people at Hughes thought that maybe I was doing something that was just completely stupid, and that they should end it at 5 years and not take it further. Well, that didn't please the chairman of the Department of Neurology, because he thought, well, see, these guys know that Stan truly is crazy, just as everyone else thinks he's crazy, because this project is not even remotely possible to tear apart and make any headway in. So I'm just going to be supporting him. And when he no longer can get a grant, I'm going to have to, then he would say to me, then I have to go to the clinic an extra day so I can earn enough money to pay his salary. And I would say, Bob, this is Bob Fishman, I would say, I'm not going to do that. I said, because you're not going to make enough money for me to really live well. So I'm going to go sell real estate, because it's very easy to do that in California, especially in San Francisco at the time. And the houses are very expensive, and I can do just fine. So you won't have me around if I can't do my science. So there was a lot of this going on. But I got some private money, which helped enormously. And I had two different private grants, and they were really important, because without that money, it would have never, I wouldn't have gone anywhere.
So, with that wind in your sails from those grants, you're able to do a lot of the really definitive work, moving into hamsters with Scrapie, so you can move a lot faster. And I know that I'm summarizing a vast number of years of
No, it's great.
really
You're doing better than I
work.
am. So keep going.
But you're able to move forward, and you've done the absolutely critical and ironclad experiments that are proving that Scrapie, in hamsters at least, is not caused by a virus, that it absolutely must be a protein. And in researching some of your background for this interview, I read an interview that you gave with the American Academy of Neurology about this time, and that you had everything, you were ready to publish it, but there was a handling editor that was kind of sitting on this and not allowing it to get out. And I found this to be an absolutely fascinating story.
Well, first of all, you got to understand that Eleanor Butz, the woman at Science, had a reputation for just doing this kind of thing, about wanting to change every letter or every word, that she was the queen of science. And eventually, I think she died of old age, but she made a lot of people unhappy with what she did. It was just not with me, but I think I made things worse for her, because she was worried that this paper might not be correct and that science would have a black eye. But what happened was that the chancellor at that time, a man named Frank Suey, who was terrific, he was approached by David Perlman, the science writer for the Chronicle newspaper. And Perlman said to Frank Suey, I would like to do an article on Stan's work. And because he found out about it, I think I met him at an airport or something and talked to him, but I can't remember where I first met him. And so uh, Perlman said, yeah, okay, but I want to interview Stan. And so that was the deal. All right. So then this was the 10th anniversary of UCSF because it had always been part of Berkeley for a long time, something like the 10th anniversary. And so that was the deal. But then once that all got settled, and then Perlman had had an article that he was pretty far along with. He called me one day and he said, I think it was a Gordon conference in Southern California, and he said, tomorrow is going to appear an article on the front page of the Chronicle about your work. And so that's what happened. And then the world went crazy because all of a sudden there was a new word, prion. That was the key. Now, all the people who were reporters got excited about this. They all wanted to know more about prions.
So the story of you coining the term prion is also really fascinating. But what I'd like to ask you about was more the reaction to it and the reaction in the scientific community to your finding. I mean, it's always really hard to overturn dogma, but it seemed like your skeptics were particularly savage.
Well, but let's go back first to why I worked on a word, because this goes back to my aunt who's age 3, and she has a playmate. And so these two young girls become very good friends. They live into their 80s. My aunt eventually dies of Alzheimer's disease. Uh, but uh, my aunt's friend married a man named Frank Westheimer, who was a very famous chemist. And so I got to know him. Uh, and he came as a visiting professor to UCSF. And I set up a time to meet with him, and he came to my little tiny office and he sat down, and I told him the whole story of how it was evolving and where it was. And he looked at me and he said, Stan, this is really important. And so this is not just a guy off the street. This is a guy who's a lifetime friend, one step removed. All right. So he said, you got to come up with a great word. This is really important. And don't mess this up, because if you don't get this right, someone else will get it right, and then we'll get the lion's share of the credit. And I'm saying, no, I can't let that happen. And so that's how the word started to work, how it came about, because I kept thinking I'm going to go to Berkeley and I'm going to walk into some professor's office of Greek, Latin, and whatever else, French, and and that professor is going to come up with a word instantaneously. Well, I never went to Berkeley to meet this professor, because I never thought this professor was going to be able to do this. So I sat there with all these words like protein and infectious and something else, and I would just pick letters, and then I would try to put some kind of minor logic together. And I come up with, one day I'm eating at the defunct faculty club, and I put Prion, and I said, oh, that looks nice. My key was to have 2 syllables, have it short, and to have protein at the beginning. And so I had PRO, so it was, or PRION, and it would work. Infectious and protein. That's were the key words. I threw away agent and everything else. And there it was. I left the faculty club and left my most of my tuna sandwich sitting there, but it wasn't very good anyway. And I walked across the street and I went up to the 7th floor where my labs were. And I had this huge dictionary like this, because there were no small computers. Um, and I looked up PRION, and it said, "Oh, it's a bird in the South Pacific, and it travels between Tasmania and the Antarctica." And I said, "Nobody's ever heard of this word, bird. So what?" And so that's what I did. I just went on from there, and it was a good thing to do. I needed to do this. Would have been really stupid to just keep calling it an agent, which is what a large people wanted to do because I not only discovered this protein, but I then put a label on something which was totally new. And that pissed off a lot of people. They were not very happy about that. Um, there are lots of people who had been studying this field for 15 years or longer, some people 30 years. They were angry because all of a sudden I grabbed all the credit and they were left saying, I don't know what they said, but it wasn't very nice. And they didn't see me as very nice. I shouldn't have done this. And I should have had a meeting and I should have had a convocation of a whole large number of people, and they should have all gotten together and come up with some word like agent to the square of, I don't know, the square root of 2.7 or something. I have no idea what should have been done, but I did what Frank Westheimer told me to do, and he was absolutely right, and he was a brilliant chemist. Um, and so that's how it all came about. And then when people kept attacking me, I kept saying, okay, I'll just keep putting out the data and we'll figure out all the details. And if somebody else wants to do some of it, they'll do it. And great, terrific. Let it be.
And time told the story, and your ongoing publications removed any doubt whatsoever. And I noticed from your CV, the list of invitations just kept going. And, it made me feel exhausted just to read in the late 80s and 90s the number of invitations and talks that you gave. And the more and more awards that you got that led to the Nobel. And at that point, do you think that you finally silenced some of your skeptics, or did they just keep going?
No, that didn't do it at all. It made them more angry. They were more pissed off. How the hell did he get this prize? And he got it alone. How come I wasn't part of that? Another guy said, I was part of that. I needed to be part of that. I mean, that's just made them more and more angry. They were just really, really angry.
I would love to know if you have a favorite recollection of the Nobel Prize ceremony or the pomp and the circumstance.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so it's I guess it's 2 o'clock in the morning and my phone rings and I'm sleeping in one of the worst beds ever. It's in a Holiday Inn right near the NIH. And there's a meeting of the FDA and I'm part of this meeting. But it's 2 in the morning and I find out that now my ex-wife, but my wife at the time, is being called in Stockholm. And she now gives a number. And I know the guy who is calling me. And he wants to make sure that I know who he is. And he tells me. And I said, yeah, okay, I understand. And he said, we're going to give you a Nobel Prize. And I said, holy shit. I don't know what I said. and he then talks a little bit and he says, you remember when we had dinner not long ago? And I said, yeah, I remember. I remember that well. And so then he says, okay, so he said, in fact, we decided to give you the whole Nobel Prize. And I said, oh, wow, it's getting better by the moment. And then he starts giving me a couple of lines about, because they always have a couple of lines that describe what it is. And I got at the top of my head, I said something. I don't remember what it is now, but I told him that. And then I think I would change the word later, one or two words. I switched them around, but it was fine. But then you see, everything's past tense. And I hang up. And this is the worst bed that I've ever slept in. I can't go back to sleep. I turn on the TV. I don't think there was a CNN at the time. And I'm trying to get some validation of this because I know a lot of people who got tricks played on them at that time of the year. And these were people who were really, really disappointed because they really were waiting for their Nobel Prize. And so I I kept looking on the TV, and then nothing happened. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. It's 5 in the morning. It's 6 in the morning. It's coming up on 7 o'clock, and there's nothing. And I said, well, this is probably the same crap that's happened to a bunch of my friends where people pull these tricks on them. And so then I turned on the radio and I said, maybe the radio will have it when the TV doesn't have it. There were radios then. Uh, and the radio was on. And then all of a sudden, Stan Prusner got the Nobel Prize. And I said, oh. So then I get dressed and I walk downstairs to this big meeting where most of these people were angrier than hell. They were upset about all this. So it wasn't that they were all congratulating me and cheering. They were pissed. And so I just sat there and I relaxed. What was I going to do? And I wasn't going to stand there and tell them this is why they gave it to me and not to you. That would have been really stupid. Uh, and then I organized this was in Washington, so but I have a lot of friends there in that area. So I organized a really nice dinner. And that was really a lot of fun. Um, and then I went back to the West Coast the next day or day and a half later. Um, and yeah, it was pretty. I don't even know the right word. I don't know the right adjective. It was pretty incredible. Maybe that's the best word I can come up with.
So do you think that in the aftermath of the Nobel Prize that there was a bully pulpit that you could use? And did you use it at all in order to influence policy at all? I note how many governmental committees that you worked with and politicians you spoke to.
No, I didn't use it in that way, but what it did its work just by being there because it it was a stamp of approval that made private funding clear. People weren't worried about it. They weren't worried that I was some charlatan. And the second thing was, at the government level, it helped a little bit, but it wasn't nearly as important as at the private level. Um, and so, yeah, I think that was huge. Um, and it didn't help me that I could get on a bus for free or I could get on an airplane for nothing. When I was at the NIH, I could travel anywhere in the country for $1 because I put on my public health service uniform. And then those days, people in the military could go anywhere for nothing on all these airplanes, but that disappeared.
If you had to do it all over again and you could not be a physician or a scientist, do you think there's another vocation that could have kept you as happy?
No, not even being president of the United States. That would have been horrible. Look what poor Biden has to go through now. Oh my God, it's horrible. No, what a privilege I've had. There's nothing that even approaches the ability to do science, to have a lot of young, wonderful colleagues, to have a lot of older colleagues, to have something to talk about that's meaningful when you talk to other people, uh, something to think about when you go to sleep, something that you think about waking up, uh, and to have a problem which takes a while to solve. That's really wonderful. I mean, you can read the whole story of Watson and Crick, but that happened too fast. Um, and and they managed to managed to get all this data from Rosalind Franklin, and Crick knew what to do with it because he had solved some of these problems of what a helix would look like by X-ray diffraction. So he had all of this, and Watson, for whatever you want to talk about or say about him, he was focused on it. He knew something was important. He could smell it, but that's not that I for sure he never got all the pleasure that I got out of one step at a time, one step at a time. And what was really wonderful was that there were very few people who were interested in doing the same thing I was doing. Yeah, there were a few, but most people weren't into that. So I didn't have this horrible competition, and at UCSF we have this kind of unwritten rule that we don't hire people who are going to compete with already existing faculty because their lives become horrible. Um, so no, this is a true fairy tale.
Dr. Prusner, thank you so much for sharing some of these stories. I could listen to you talk for hours, and I bet there are so many other fantastic stories to be told. But we'll leave that for the next time.